background test off. Thanks. Okay, we have come to the hour that a lot of you all are here for, and that is by ways of our monthly educational community-based program. And every month we hold these programs because we want to inform the community on issues that affect all Americans. We want to educate the community on these particular issues, and once you have been informed and educated, that will ultimately empower you to make better daily decisions in your daily journey of life. So there should have been some pamphlets passed out that talks about the 401 and the 50 that the NAACP has established, and Reverend David Fox is going to moderate this session. He is the chair of our Criminal Justice Department for the NAACP in Dayton. So, Chairman Fox, if you can introduce your guest.
Amen. We are happy tonight to have this great, fabulous board. Our experts in the area of criminal justice in the city of Dayton, Ohio. What concerns us all over the country is that young men are being killed. And in Ohio, the preservation of life is of the utmost importance. I had a call before I came here tonight, and the person wanted to talk about all the problems in the city. I said, that's not this forum. That's not what this is for. We're not coming here to talk about problems. We're not coming here to talk about situations that we can't do anything about, because we can do something about the problems that we have in this community. So our goal tonight is simply this, is to explore ways that we can use less lethal devices to help preserve the lives of some of the people that otherwise could have lived under conditions and situations in which they may not have been shot or killed. That's our goal. That's our conversation. That's what it's all about. We're not here to deal with drug problems. We're not here to deal with gambling problems. We're not here to deal with prostitute problems. We are only here to talk about deciding when to use less lethal devices. So we have tonight, which we consider to be some of our best leading authorities on this state, okay? We have Chief Richard Bill, who has spent 36 years in law enforcement. Comes from Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was there, the assistant chief, and worked himself up there. And he is here today to work and give us some information. And he came to Dayton, Ohio in 2008, which is interesting. That was a good year. The reason why it was a good year is because that same year, our next panelist, Sheriff Phil Plummer, was appointed as sheriff of this county. He also has been in law enforcement for quite a while, started in 1988 as a correction officer at the jail, moved up to the ranks, and now he is the sheriff. That goes to tell you, if we got young people there, you need to understand that you got to start somewhere. Sheriff Plummer is a good evidence of how one can go up the ranks and become the sheriff of this great city and county. Then we have next Captain Eric Wilson, Trotwood Police Department. This is interesting. Captain Wilson, even though he's the captain, but he's also the assistant to the chief right now. The chief is working hard as a city manager, acting, and so he can't spend a lot of his time doing the kind of administrative work, so he's got our good friend here, Eric Wilson, doing that work. And last but not least, Amaha Salisi. He is going to also be with us tonight. He is the chairman of the Human Relations Council here in the city of Dayton, and he's very active in the community and very hardworking in our community. Let me give some ground rules. We will do this like this. Each one of our panelists will have 8 minutes to deal with the subject matter. I have a stopwatch here, so I will time each one of them to make sure they only go 8 minutes. After they are concluded, then we will have a brief summary of that, and then we will turn it over to the audience and allow you to ask questions. You are allowed to come up to the microphone, state your name, and state your question. Your question should be in the first sentence of your conversation. Y'all understand what I'm talking about, right? We don't want a long dissertation. Just come up and state your question, and these experts will give you your answer. You can single out a particular person, or you can address your question to all of the experts here tonight. 2 questions that I have that I want to be thought about. What guides the officer's discretion to use force? And then number 2, an officer fires his gun or his weapon. What are the implications under the law? So we'll start with Chief Hill.
Well, in terms of general use of force, that's governed by primarily by federal Supreme Court cases, which have shaped and continue to shape police officers' use of counterforce in executing arrests and taking people into custody. So the highest court of the land dictates a lot of how police officers do what they do as it relates to seizing individuals under the Constitution and also utilizing force if necessary to take people into custody. It's also shaped potentially by state law or state policy. There's administrative standards set through OPATA, the Ohio Police Officers Training Academy, the Ohio Police Officers Training Council. So the state helps shape policies and practices of police officers, and then also local policies shape how police officers do their job, what they do, and how they do it. So all those help define how police officers do their job, including effecting arrests and, when necessary, using force to effect those arrests. As it relates to use of a firearm, that is also governed a lot by Supreme Court decisions over time. There was a really important case called Tennessee v. Gardner that was decided, gosh, I'm thinking maybe close to 30 years ago now, that dealt with the use of deadly force to apprehend a fleeing felon. And that was a significant case because it said basically just because someone is a felon and fleeing from police does not justify the use of deadly force. So in that particular case, if it did say that it's not unreasonable for police officers to use deadly force against a felon under certain circumstances when they are fleeing, but generally just because they're fleeing and they're wanted for a felony offense does not justify deadly force. So a consequence of use of deadly force under circumstances where someone is a fleeing felon and it does not meet specific criteria established by the court, that would be considered a crime. So it really depends, like everything else, on the circumstances. Police officers are trained in the use of force to effect arrests, to including deadly force, and the propriety of those actions is ultimately determined by the totality of the circumstances and the incident in which it occurs. So there's not a simple, if A occurs, then B is okay. There's not that, usually that level of clarity as it relates to police use of force to take someone into custody. So I'll kind of stop there because there's an opportunity to make this a dialogue and not a monologue.
Okay. You know, most police departments have very similar use of force policies, and we train our officers every year on these policies. You know, our organization has 4 accreditations, so we meet national standards in 4 different areas, and one of them being the road patrol. That's where we invite other agencies into our organization. They look at our policies, they turn us upside down to make sure we meet national standards. So, you know, that's something we're very proud of because we know our policies are met across the nation. And it's our job as leaders to train our officers to know the policies and to follow the policies. And we do a very good job of that. You know, there's a lot of people, you know, get upset when officers have to use force, but I can tell you guys this: no officer wants to use force. No officer wants to wake up in the morning and shoot an individual or harm an individual. You know, the majority of the officers are good people trying to do the right thing. So, you know, if you have an issue with certain officers, feel free to contact your commanders and your respective police departments, and you know, air your complaints out. But for the most part, we train our officers on use of force, and you know, that they comply, and we do the best we can to make sure they comply. Like in the jail, I have 260 cameras in the jail where almost every spot in that jail is recorded, where I can watch officers' behaviors. I can protect inmates, and I also can protect the employees. So, you know, we do our best to really train our officers properly and make sure they do what's right.
Sheriff. Again, like the sheriff said, I'm not going to go over the same details that they both talked about, but the City of Trotwood Police Department also is an accredited agency, and we follow the same rules and standards. And basically, anytime one of our officers is going to use force, it is in defense of themselves or one of the citizens in the City of Trotwood or their visitors. Now, as the sheriff said, if you do come across a problem where you think an officer used unnecessary force, we do have mechanisms in place where you can report that officer. And we do investigate and we look into these matters. And sometimes we will find that the citizen was right and the officer is wrong, and then they'll move through the discipline process. But again, I'm not going to repeat over everything they're going to say because we all are trained the same way, we follow the same rules, and we stay in line with those rules that govern our organizations.
I think I'm going to begin by giving thanks for this panel happening and having this conversation between the police and community, because I think it's important for how we can move forward as a community. And within that, I think it's also important to acknowledge that police are part of the community as well. And so I know they have a formal authority and a position as police officers, but also recognizing that they're community members as well, and so they have to operate in 2 different spaces. And so kind of like the humanizing aspect of the police officers. I think one of the challenges, I guess, for me is it's the use of force sometimes, but also I think how is it determined when to use force? And in specific, with the relation in regards to the color line, meaning that like there's numerous reports that show that if you're lighter skinned, regardless of your quote unquote race, but if you're lighter skinned, you're perceived as less of a threat than if you're darker skinned, be it you're Latino, African American, Asian, it doesn't matter. And how during split-second decisions, that oftentimes can lead to a difference of if force is being used or not being used, because someone who's darker skinned is seen as more aggressive or seen as more of a threat. And so I'm really here with more questions than answers, but really like seeing like how do we really build and restore trust within the community? Because even the stress of being of a darker skin, that's a continuous stress that is like a daily occurrence within the community. You know, there's the threat of, am I going to make it home okay? There's a threat of, there's always this notion of a lack of trust that results in extra stress, which then also affects the health of the community as well. And so I'm really here to seek more answers of how we can restore the trust in the community in regards to how lethal force is used.
Okay, Chief, Bill, you mentioned the Garner case, which deals with the reasonableness for an officer in terms of making a decision when to shoot. But the Graham case, or Graham decision, dealt with the use of force continuum. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I think there's probably some confusion about that. That's not a terminology that's used often now in law enforcement because it creates a bit of confusion that a continuum would suggest that in a scale of, say, force options, you must always start at the lowest and then go to the next lowest and on up like a ladder, and you have to exhaust all those lower forms before you go to the highest form. Well, that's not the case. If someone points a firearm at a police officer to say that they should use pepper spray or use a taser when confronted with a firearm, it's not reasonable. So the term continuum is not used often in law enforcement training. You often talk about more is that what are those force options? What are the choices? What is proportional in response to the threat that the police officer faces? So it really depends on the circumstances, specific circumstances of any event or incident, to weigh what is in fact reasonable. And the court was pretty clear. It said it's based on the judgment of a reasonable officer at the scene. So that's an important language used by the court. And so when you have disputes, for instance, about propriety of an officer using force, or really the more accurate term is counterforce because it's in response to aggression by citizens. We said properly done is in response to aggression by citizens, let me say that. You really have to look at all of those circumstances that the officer faced, and it really is what we call case specific. So there really isn't a step-by-step graduated response to force. It's an officer confronted with a specific threat, and then there's various options, and is it proportional to the threat that the officer faced? That's what the courts look at. That's what we look at in assessing use of force or counter force, which I think is a more appropriate term.
Sheriff Plummer, do you have a policy on using less lethal devices?
Yeah, we have policies on using less lethal devices, and we have several at our disposal. We have pepper spray. We're all familiar with pepper spray. We have the ASP baton. If you guys aren't familiar with that, it's a metal baton that extends that you can use as a defensive weapon. We have beanbag rounds, less lethal beanbag rounds that we've now put back into the cruisers of our supervisors. So we have several different less lethal options available for us. We encourage the guys to use them. We also have tasers. There's a lot of controversies about tasers, but I believe in tasers, and if we can use it instead of using a firearm, it's to our benefit. But there's been some court rulings against tasers recently that we're all going to have to evaluate. I mean, some people were using them as prodding tools instead of a defense tool. So there's some court cases coming down about that we evaluate. But less lethal options are very important to us, and we train on them every year. And we encourage our people to use them as often as possible.
Yes, the city of Trotwood also has tasers, ASP baton, pepper spray, and the beanbag rounds also. And as the sheriff just said, those are defensive weapons in our eyes. Trotwood officer's not going to come out there and engage anybody with any of those weapons except for in the defense of his person or one of our citizens. We too train every year. It's mandated through our state that we receive training and all that equipment, and we have rules and policies in place that govern the use of that.
Yeah, I think being law enforcement is a very challenging job, because, on one hand, you're here to serve and protect the community, and then on the other hand, everybody's seeking to get home to their families, and so I think that's where part of the challenge comes in sometimes, because, what we heard tonight is very, is textbook answers, and I think that's, correct. But I think on the ground, it plays out differently in both perspectives. And I think that's what determines what that threat is, and if there's markers that leads to a higher threat assessment than what is necessary. And even the challenge of counter force, oftentimes, well not oftentimes, but there are cases where, there is no gun, but there's a perception of that or something like that. So like that counter force is based upon a perception sometimes. I think that's where the challenge lies. It's like how do we have the training to really acknowledge implicit bias and incorporate that into officer procedures so that they have another tool at their disposal when they're making these split-second decisions based upon little evidence at the time.
After the situation in Ferguson looked at a less lethal device called the alternative. Are y'all familiar with that, Chief? Well, the alternative is a disposable piece that goes over top of the gun. And then the purpose of it, once the gun is fired, it shoots a projectile into the component of that piece of plastic, which slows down the velocity of the bullet 1/5 of a percentage of the speed of the bullet, so that when it hits a person, it hits them with force, enough force to slow them down and knock them down, rather than to kill them. Now, once the projectile was gone from the gun now is ready for fire. So it's in battery state, it's ready for fire. So, do you have any? I know you haven't seen it, but how do you feel about that kind of a technology that's being used in Ferguson as a way to deal with the kind of situations that are going on?
Well, I'll go back to my initial comment, is you have to look at the threat that the officer is faced with. So you have to evaluate anything based on its effectiveness, and that needs to be tested before it's deployed. So if it's intended to be non-lethal, an impact, basically some kind of an impact round as opposed to a penetrating round, you'd have to ask, is it reasonable to expect a police officer to use such a device when confronted with a lethal threat? So in the case where there is a potential lethal threat and less lethal devices are deployed, that is always deployed while there's another officer present, at least according to our training and policy, that has lethal option capability. Because you do not want to face a lethal threat with a less lethal, sometimes the term is used, non-lethal option. Because if it doesn't work, then the officer faces a lethal threat and they're unprepared to face that threat. So it would not be reasonable to ask a police officer or a citizen, by the way, to use something that was less than effective when confronted with a lethal threat. So I'd actually have to see what this looks like in a training environment, see its potential, see where its application would make sense or would not make sense. So it's something that has to be evaluated.
They have this at their disposal. They purchased them. They are trying them out now. It's carried on the side, and if the officer, once he sees what you're talking about, someone who does not have a weapon, rather than using a weapon against someone who does not have a weapon, they're able to put it on the gun within less than 3 seconds and then use it then. That's what makes it different. We totally agree. You're not going to go, it's like going to a knife fight with a knife and then somebody else got a gun. So no, you don't want to do that. Now, we're going to do one more question and then we're going to open it up because I know there's probably a lot of questions coming out of the audience. Right? All right. Okay, what time? Let's see. It's 1:15, right? I think we'll start with the audience now, because we only have about 15 to 20 more minutes anyway. And I know that's going to take some time for people to come and ask questions. Come on. Wait a minute. want you to come up too. Come up here first. Come on up too. Come on and get in line. This mic works? Yes. Okay, good.
My name is John Chapman, member of the NAACP. My question, in the training, is there a designated amount of rounds that officers can fire versus like emptying the whole clip?
Anyone want to answer that question?
There's not a designated number of rounds. It relates to the officer's use of a firearm in that particular case. Does it stop the threat? So it's about stopping the threat. You fire 6 rounds and you miss 5 times, you haven't stopped the threat, most likely. Most training involves firing at least 2 rounds. Some cases it's 4 or 6, so it really depends on each training scenario. And that's just for basic qualification. So it's not how many rounds, it is the minute the threat stops, force must stop. So if that's 1 round or 5 rounds, that's what determines it. Once the threat ends. And that could end with the person surrendering, it could end with the person being incapacitated, it could end with the person dying, but it's really about when the threat ends.
You know, we get our training mandates from the state, the basic training mandate. So, you know, we may get, you know, they'll say, you got to shoot 6 times with your right hand in 10 seconds. So, you know, it isn't like we just train shooting 1 round, 2 rounds. They tell you how to train. You may have to do the same scenario with your weekend. So, you know, training, I know people want to look at different training, but there's the state mandates qualifications that, you know, unfortunately we have to follow the basics. We try to do above and beyond that with different training scenarios, but a lot of this stuff gets forced on us.
I think one of the things everybody has to understand that even though we are men in uniform wearing a badge and we train with these weapons, we are still just human. And a lot of times, in some of the scenarios, those guys didn't realize how many times they fired. And when you know, I've been in a situation where I investigated a police officer involved shooting, and he couldn't tell how many times he fired a gun. It was just, he had to stop the threat, and until that threat is incapacitated, you know, you don't know what you're doing at that point, because it's going 1,000,000 miles a minute. So it's not that somebody's trying to be inhumane, it's just, you know, we are humans too.
Let me add something to that right quick. Chief, isn't the goal to knock the person down? To really knock them down and knock them off their feet? I mean, they no longer pose a threat.
And knocking someone down, knocking them off the feet, stop the threat.
But you're going to keep shooting if they're not down, aren't you?
Well, the threat is still present. The legal threat is still present. Shooting can continue.
Yeah, so once they're on the ground, you shouldn't be shooting them no more, right?
As long as there's no threat.
All right.
You can still shoot from the ground.
Well, yeah, right. All right.
Hi, my name is Jamila Henderson. I actually have 2 questions. My first question is, do officers receive diversity training? And my other question is are there specific guidelines to deal with children? Other guidelines?
Good question. Who want to tackle that one? Now you are the Human Relations Counsel. You should know that answer to that.
You know, we just had a big diversity training at the end of last year from Eric Ellis down out of Cincinnati, which was tremendous, which we opened up to all the departments in the county. We just had Eric Ellis back and we retrained my command staff, so that is a priority for us and we'll continue to train on that. And that's a great question. I wish that was mandated across the board for everyone. There are guidelines as far as use of force on children. You know, we really try to take care of the children, you know, and we hope officers use common sense. And I think a lot of people refer to the situation up in Cleveland where, you know, they shot the child with the gun or the Plus BB gun, yeah. See, that's the problem though. These guys, they jump out of the car and they think their life's in danger and they do what they have to do. And there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, you have to get intelligence, good intelligence from the dispatcher who's taking the phone call to give the officer arriving on the scene. He only knows what he's being told. So, you know, there's critical training components in the dispatch center also who's taking the phone call from the person calling us. Because that intelligence there is very important on the officer that may have to make a critical decision. So, you know, everybody in this room loves children. No officer wants to hurt a child, you know. And can you imagine having to shoot a child? You wouldn't be sleeping for many nights. So, you know, we really do the best we can with children.
Yeah, one of the challenges when you combine the age, you know, a child with diversity, with Tamir Rice's example clearly shows, is that African American children, males, are seen as older than they really are. So, like even when you heard the first reports, they reported that he was like 21 or something like that. You know, and so it's like, that's why I keep going through the perception, and it might seem like I'm doing something else, but I keep talking about like how the threat is perceived is going to determine what kind of force is being used. And like, that's why I think the training is so important, because African American boys are being seen as adults, and they're being seen as hyper aggressive. And so that is determining a higher level of force than what is called for in the situation. And so that's where I think it's, you know, the training and the understanding of these scenarios need to be more incorporated inside of police policies.
My name is Anthony Roebuck, lead organizer for the Stop Mass Incarceration Miami Valley. My question is, you guys spoke on skin color at the beginning of the discussion. Because of the implement bias of skin color, do you think that officers should receive psychological exams before going on duty every day?
Every day?
Every day.
I don't think that's possible, because of one, the time it would take, and how comprehensive is that psychological evaluation going to be? Because I have 8 hours for this guy to be on the street, and it sounds like that evaluation, if it's anything like the one we had to take when we got our jobs, that was very extensive and intense, and that took a couple hours. So I don't know if that would be quite possible to give them a psychological evaluation every day.
Are those evaluations that are given?
Yeah, hello, I'm Kenneth Page. I'm with the NAACP. I think the two young people before me kind of did a good job of providing the context for this question. I'm a little old, so I have to write down what I'm going to say. I'd like for each of you to report on your agency's progress towards meeting the recent standards handed down by the Ohio Collaborative Community Police Advisory Board. I think the young person here got to part of that includes training, diversity. While the young brother's question was about psychology, there is a certain part of that the standards that are issued talking about making sure that officers are healthy and sharp and alert and haven't been drinking, don't have some kind of other problems when they go out to work. And so, sorry to be long-winded, Brother Chairman. My question is, what are each of your agencies doing to meet those standards put forward by the statewide advisory board, which are going to be measured in 2017? Thank you.
They probably haven't got started yet.
We have reviewed those standards, and it's our, it's our assessment that we're in compliance, other than perhaps some of the documentation of that. We have a new software system that we're basically will track all of our training that we think will fulfill the documentation component of it. In terms of pragmatically complying, we believe we're in compliance. Let me say, a lot of the things that were discussed in the collaborative really didn't apply, I would say, to most large agencies in the state. They have been ahead of this for a long, long time. in terms of psychological evaluations for police candidates, polygraph, background investigations, fitness components. All of those have been in place for most large agencies and probably even the smaller agencies for decades. So there are some agencies that aren't in compliance in the state of Ohio. I would say that's probably the exception rather than the rule. But for most large agencies, have been compliant for decades.
Oh, Fred Williams, member of the NAACP, life member. I'm trying to get some thought between a taser and a gun. Do most officers think that tasers are really for their protection?
Again, the taser, I believe, was developed to be a non-lethal tool to be used. The other alternative, what would the other alternative be? Supposedly the tasers, and I say supposedly because I do believe there's been some documented fatalities with the use of tasers, but that is a device that is used with the hope that it will subdue the person that you're in contact with. Now, the only reason you should be using the taser is because the person that you're in contact with is not compliant, you're trying to effect an arrest, and they're resisting and fighting with you. Other than that, I don't see a need why a person would use a taser. And I hope that answered your question, because I'm not understanding what you're trying to say. What's the difference between a taser and a weapon?
No, I heard the statement made that the officers use tasers for defense. And I was wondering if they thought that tasers were for defense of the officers.
Yes, that was me who made that comment, and it is. All our tools are used for our defense. We're not the aggressors, or I would hope we're not the aggressors out there. The only time an officer is going to engage a citizen and use a taser or a firearm is in the defense of their lives or the lives of somebody else that has been put in jeopardy at that moment.
Are all protesters seeing this conversation?
Just a quick follow-up on the protection aspect. Tasers are not intended to be used to confront a lethal threat unless there is additional backup officers that have lethal threat capability. So you don't take a taser when someone has a firearm pointed at you. However, there are dozens of incidents since I have been chief where a taser has been used by a Dayton police officer where the person was pulling a firearm or fleeing or in a wrestling match with the officer trying to get into custody where a taser was used, where a firearm was recovered from the person who was being arrested. The reason you never heard about that in the news is because the individual never had the opportunity to get to that gun and potentially use it against a police officer. So you don't recognize, although not intended to be used in a situation where there is a lethal threat present, the fact tasers have been used many times by Dayton police officers where there's been a firearm present by the individual they're trying to arrest, which in my judgment, and certainly in a number of those cases, likely avoided the use of deadly force. You never hear about it because it's not reported in the media, because it's not a headline. The shooting that doesn't happen is not a headline, just the one that does.
Thank you, Chief. Next. May I give you a question, sir?
Thank you all for coming out. My question pertains to what happens after the use of lethal force. Some have said that the fact that prosecutors must rely on police officers to do their jobs makes it difficult to investigate those incidents within that jurisdiction. So I'm wondering what y'all would think of a special prosecutor's office for officer-involved shootings and what that might do for the use of lethal force. Thank you.
Anybody want to do it?
Sure, why not? Let me just say, first of all, the question of a special prosecutor is probably more appropriately the responsibility to investigate any incident where they believe a crime has occurred. So I think it's not so much a discussion of a special prosecutor so much as what's being proposed is an outside police or law enforcement agency conducting the investigation, which goes to the prosecutor. That's more of the dialogue that is occurring across the nation. You know, I guess I would say that the jury's out perhaps in whether or not that is a great idea, either from a law enforcement standpoint and or from the public standpoint. And the question is, what does that outside agency, whoever that may be, bring to the table? Because any investigation done by a police agency of an officer-involved shooting is subject to public review. It's that once the case is resolved, all of the documentation, all of the evidence can be released under Ohio Public Records Law. Also, if there is a complaint in some nexus, some evidence to believe there's been a civil rights violation, the Department of Justice has the ability to come in and conduct investigation, which has happened locally and around the country. So any law enforcement investigation done locally really is never the final story, should there still be doubt, question, concerns about propriety of police action. So the question is, do you basically have a police agency, and I would say myself as a chief, has responsibility to investigate everything that occurs in the city that's a crime? Do I start giving away that responsibility? I feel that at this point, until it's been demonstrated that an agency is not capable, and there are clearly agencies that aren't capable of doing it, they never had a homicide. To start with a police shooting that involved somebody's death, to start with that as a homicide investigation, in my opinion, is a mistake. So the first question is, do they really have the expertise to do it? The question is then, after that, then it's more of a, I guess, where the public opinion's going to go and where the legislator's going to go with this. Is there going to be compelled for local law enforcement to basically abdicate their responsibility, their duty to investigate that and give it to some outside agency? I just think we have to wait and see where that goes. I'm sure it's going to be an interesting dialogue along the way. I'm going to hand it back over.
Yeah, let me give this lady here. She was up there first.
My name is Ruby Thompson, and I'm a member of the NAACP. And I'm working into my finals with undergraduate course with criminal justice. And what I'm concerned about is the Dayton police force up on the technology with the weapons that they're using, because they're trying to invent the guns where they just have one straight shot, where they don't have, like they have a lot of bullets in the cartridge, because they were saying that this is unsafe. So they're working hard to try to improve the weapons with the law enforcement, with the officers that are involved. They have found that there's been a lot of issues with defective guns and this issue. So I was just concerned, wanted to bring that up, if this is something that has been brought to the attention of the Dayton police force, with any new weapons that they're trying to present.
Is your question related to the police guns being defective or the people?
Well, what they're saying is because in the past, if they shot, bullets would go everywhere.
Who?
You see, ricochet. With the guns that they're using or have used in the past with the law enforcement.
Oh.
So what they're trying to do is get the guns made where there's only one bullet, one straight shot without all that distraction.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much for that information. I said thank you so much for that information.
Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
We'll
right now in Oregon, there are over 100 protesters, armed protesters that are occupying federal lands at a national wildlife refuge. And these folks are heavily armed, and they've been there for over 3 weeks. And it's been all over the news. Nothing has been done. I think that if they were Black Lives Matter protesters or NAACP protesters, the government and law enforcement in that area, both federal, state, and local, would have a different response. How can the citizens of Dayton and Montgomery County know that we will not be treated in any different kind of way if we are peacefully protesting, armed or unarmed, on public lands, such as those that are protesting over in Oregon, when they are doing so illegally?
Okay, Chief, you want to answer that? Okay, and Chief's going to also answer the lady's question also about the guns. Could you just tell her what kind of guns we use or you use?
Well, we have a number of different types of weapons. The street officers carry a Glock semi-automatic pistol, so that's the firearm carried 45 caliber. Obviously, SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics, utilize other weaponry because they face at times a much more difficult threat scenario. I'm not certain about the question about shooting one bullet. I don't quite understand that aspect of it, but do we keep up with the technology of weaponry or weapons? Yes, we continue to look and evaluate what's out there and see if it's something that can be utilized. So there's weapons out there that are trying to be marketed. They're used biometrics that only the person who owns that weapon can fire that weapon. I mean, I know that technology has been out there actually for a while. It's used at Ring. Now they're actually using biometric fingerprints. So we certainly follow those things. We would evaluate those, determine whether they have a role or a place in the environment of law enforcement. So yes, we do keep up with that technology, I guess. The second question, remind me what the second question was. So what was it about? Oregon, the protest. Yeah, I would just say look at the history here, recent history in the city of Dayton, Montgomery County, and I think you get an idea of how to respond to those kind of events. I mean, you can only look to Occupy Dayton of a number of years ago. Do you remember, did you follow that at all? Did you see, remember folks who occupied the courthouse square? Did you see how Montgomery County and Dayton Police and the city of Dayton responded to that? If they were armed, again, it comes back to the circumstances like everything else, right? So it depends if someone is basically just exercising their Second Amendment right. We have individuals who come in the city with open carry and are very out front with the fact that they're carrying weaponry. If they're acting lawfully, they're not bothered. So I think it really depends on the circumstances, like everything else. But I think you just look at the history of how we responded to many of the protests over the past few years to get an idea how we respond and try to give a lot of latitude for individuals to express their constitutional rights, even in circumstances where they really don't have the right, the lawful right to do some things they do. We look at it from a broader view, I would say, to say, you know, somebody blocks the street for a short period of time, it's at the end of the world. Because we want everybody just to be safe. That's the goal. But I think you just look at, I'll say you look at the history of how we've handled the protests in the past few years, and I would disagree.
About the earlier question about the use of grand juries. I like the chief's answer at first about when he said, why not? And the reason I say that is I think it's also a community trust issue because having the prosecutor being in the same basically league as the ones that they're going to have to, you know, find if they're, you know, worth going forward with an investigation or not, it just seems like there's a conflict of interest, you know? And so I think having someone who's independent reviewing these cases will restore more community trust in the process, which is basically eroded because most of the times, you know, if it goes to grand jury, it always ends up without leaving grand jury without an indictment or anything. And so, so I guess what I'm trying to find too is like ways that the community and police can work together. And like I think restoring trust is like a crucial factor at this time. And so I think like I'm calling on the police, the law enforcement to also push for things that like even if it might not be deemed, they might not feel it's completely necessary. If they feel that it will restore community trust, that just for that aspect alone, that they would, you know, advocate for these type of things.
My name is Kevin Gilby. I think Mr. Alvin touched on the basics of my $100 million question is, out of all these shootings, do you think the outcome would have been the same if the person was white? My second question is, do police officers know that the black community thinks there's two different types of justices in the United States? The kind that's for just us, and then there's the kind for everybody else.
Okay, Eric.
What was the question again? I thought it was more of a statement.
The question is, do you think the outcome of all of the shootings would have been the same person as white? Guy got choked on the street in New York. Guy got killed playing with a gun. Somebody had to take the gun out of the pocket. So somebody else playing with the gun. They didn't. Police officers know that black community thinks two different types of justices in the United States.
Well, I believe, I know that, I've heard that. Anytime something happens, I have to face the court of Wilson. So, being that I'm the only police officer in my family, I get these same questions. It's kind of hard, like I tell my family, it's kind of hard to give you the answer when I don't have all the facts before me. I know we've heard about what happened all over the country, but have we heard everything? Did we get all the evidence, all the preponderance of evidence to sit there and make that decision? So it's hard to answer that question. Would it have happened if it would have been a white guy? I know if it was me on the other end of it, I don't care what color you are. I'm looking at everybody as the same humans. I'm trying to come home at the end of the day, and I believe in treating people with respect. Because respect is earned, not given. Just because I walk in this room doesn't mean everybody's going to have to respect me. My actions dictate how you want to respect me. So if you come with respect, I give respect. So I can't answer for a million police officers across this country as to what would happen without having all the facts in front of me to sit down and really see.
Honestly, I don't think it's fair. I'm sure that question is going about now.
Okay. And I accept that, what you're saying, sir, but I can only answer it from my heart.
Okay, real quick, first of all, I'm Michelle Mullins. I'm with the Community Progress Institute, and I'm also a member of the Stop Mass Incarceration Miami Valley. I just wanted to know, what is the procedure in hiring a diverse police force?
The procedure is, it's a community problem we all face, and we all need to work together on this because we all need more diversity in our police forces. You know, and I take that personally as the sheriff here in Montgomery County because at the minimum, our forces should reflect our community. At the minimum, and they don't across the board. They don't. I Major Wilson here, he's my major. I just promoted Judy Seeley. She's an African-American female, first African-American female promoted to the command staff in the history of the Sheriff's Office, which is very embarrassing, but I just did it because my command staff now reflects our population. You know, I just stole a young African-American from Germantown. I mean, we steal, anyone we can get, we steal them from each other. But you guys help us out with this. I mean, we got to get into the faith community more, but we need more minorities in the police force. You know, I understand the minority community doesn't want a white person in there telling them how to live their lives. You know, we need more diversity here. And we're all for that, but we need help. And if you guys can help us, God bless you, we'll take it.
My question leads back to diversity. My name is Lisa Becca Willis, and I am a concerned citizen as well as a member of the NAACP. Earlier, the gentleman here on the end spoke about the societal issue of the hierarchy of race and color. I'm curious to know how difficult would it be, Sheriff Plummer, to institute mandatory diversity training, because it is a societal issue, and I do believe it begins with education, really at the age of, my daughter's age 5, kids. And so then people can grow up and be aware. We have no reason to fear one another, but yet we fear one another. So how difficult would it be to institute diversity training, mandatory annual diversity training?
Okay, Chief says it's going to be mandatory from the state of Ohio, so it's coming, you know, and if it isn't, we'll keep pushing it, and we'll push the legislators to make it mandatory. It's very important, you know, it just truly is.
And let me just touch on this really quickly, that there's this whole body of research on something called procedural justice. And quite honestly, it's law enforcement, I guess, finally woke up that I heard this discussed with great enthusiasm at the IACP conference in Chicago in 2011. It's the first I had heard this actually discussed by a police agency suggesting that we need to move toward embodying procedural justice in our criminal justice practices, law enforcement specifically. The research on procedural justice is anything but new. The research on implicit racial bias is not necessarily new either. Both of those are going to be requirements this year in the state of Ohio for training Ohio police officers. Here's the unique insight, I would say, about procedural justice. We like to believe that the answer to better police-community relations is in diversity training. That's the answer. And that's been the solution that has been worked pretty vigorously for decades in policing. What's been missed in the procedural justice, and this is research out of Chicago, involving the courts as well as police officers in Chicago, and then repeated around the country. What's interesting, what they found is that if authorities, whether they be judges or police officers, acted in a certain way when engaging and encountering citizens, that the citizens saw authorities acting legitimately, irrespective of the citizen's race or ethnicity. That was a surprise, I think, that if police officers or judges acted in certain ways in their communication with citizens, the citizens, irrespective of whether Hispanic, Latino, white, Caucasian, saw authorities as acting legitimately. I think we have focused to our detriment to some degree on if we just understand each other better, we'll get along better. If we don't communicate better, even though we understand each other better, it's not going to be for better relationships. That was the power of the research on procedural justice. The state developed a curriculum on that I think I went to that training about a year ago at Sinclair Community College. I thought they did a really good job in 8 hours of putting all the pieces together, as well as talking about practices of law enforcement over decades that has created a historic distrust in communities of color. So finally, toward the very end of my career, are we seeing law enforcement recognizing what needs to be done to improve police-community relations? And it is certainly dependent as much upon, if not more so, a communication skill set than it is merely understanding cultural differences. Not that I'm opposed to understanding cultural differences, but if we don't communicate in a certain way, that understanding is not going to carry the day. So what are those key elements of procedural justice? First, citizens are heard. Second, it's communicated clearly they have been heard. Third, whatever decision or there's an outcome. That's kind of procedural justice boiled down to its simplest terms. That's a communication skill set, and it's clear citizens know when they've been heard and when they're not. And we'll go to some recent experiences of mine, but it's when I don't feel heard by government that serves me, it upsets me, as it should any citizen who doesn't feel they're heard, they're not being treated respectfully, what is offered in terms of information isn't considered by authorities before they take action. Here's a practical example. Research says that for those who have been accused of domestic violence, which there's probable cause for arrest, we have a policy of preferred arrest in the state. If there's evidence that someone is a primary aggressor, we're kind of duty-bound to make that arrest. But in the mere asking the offender, the individual who has allegedly committed the crime, to tell their story, tell me your story of what happened. The mere telling the story, even if they're arrested afterwards, is linked to lower recidivism, less likely to reoffend. Isn't that what we want? Don't we want the victim of domestic violence to be safer? Well, if we want to be safer, we need to give the person who is identified as a primary aggressor the opportunity to tell their story. That's a practical example. So I know it's kind of a long explanation, but this is important enough for everyone to kind of get it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, especially the community being heard, and that's why I think we kind of co-produce having more community input, which we're actually working on it in Dayton, and I appreciate that of the community standards and everything is being something that's co-produced with the community and law enforcement together. You know, I really do think it's important that all sides are heard and that we're moving forward together and producing whatever standards and what does policing look like in our community. So I appreciate that.
Right before you ask your question, I just want to address the diversity question. Early on, inside of I believe my second administration, I was just trying to look it up. Myself and my first vice president, Reverend Branham, actually met with, I believe, Chief Bill and his command staff, to talk about joint diversity training. And that's something we talked about early on in my administration. Because when we sat down, when I very first became president, we talked about having a proactive civil rights agenda. We wanted to make certain that we got ahead of the curve before anything happened. But in that training, we talk about joint diversity training. So that is their command staff along with the NAACP doing it together. And that door is still open. Unfortunately, it took an incident to happen, and we also had the same conversation because I was trying to look it up with the Sheriff's Department to do joint diversity training as well. But unfortunately, it took us a bad situation to happen in order for that to occur. It occurred when I was there to go through the training with them. And I also asked citizens at that point in time when Sheriff Plummer put the diversity training out there, I also asked citizens to get engaged and go through that diversity training because if we're going to do this diversity training, I think we need to do it together as law enforcement and community. That's really because they actually showed some good, they didn't conduct it, they had an outside person who was African American who actually conducted the diversity training. And he actually had some different scenarios, video scenarios of different cases that has happened and asking, well, what would you have done in this particular situation? I believe it was very impactful and I think it would be very beneficial for citizens to get engaged in that as well. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
About that diversity training. So this is for the sheriff because I attended, so it was open to the public. I could not thank you more for opening it to the public, because a lot of departments would not. So I'm very glad that I attended, and thank you for Maha for telling me about it. So building on the last few questions, because y'all got at some of the things I was going to ask, my question is about follow-up and enforcement of that training, because to my knowledge, just talking to Eric Ellis and when I was there's a satisfaction survey. How did you like the training? What's the plan to see if it works? What is your outcome of success? So what is the measurable thing that we can measure to see if it worked, right? What's the definable variable? And two, what is the plan to motivate officers to continue to care? Because I get a sense, it's just an impression, that for some people, they view it as a thing they check off on a box and said they did it, but there's no motivation to continue. Same with like a DARE program, we do that to keep kids off drugs. A giant mountain taller than me of evidence that shows that DARE doesn't work. And do you want to know the main reason why? Because there's no follow-up. It's a one and done session, and there are drug prevention programs that work for kids, but they require follow-up and measuring outcomes and enforcement and keeping kids motivated. So my question is, how do we prevent this from being a one and done, that officers check off on a box to say they did it, but we need a measurable outcome for success? What is that variable? How do we keep them motivated? And what is your plan for enforcing it? A lot of questions in one,
The follow-up is I just retrained my command staff. The unfortunate thing is that's a very, very expensive training. Not that that's an excuse, but we all have very limited budgets. But it has to start at the top, and it's my goal to continue with that training. And it was very good training. We learned a lot, and we're going to continue with it. But you know, another thing we need in this community, and we have, you guys, a lot of you are on my impact committee, improving modern police and community trust. A lot of you guys come to a monthly meeting. Dayton has one very similar to that. We have to sit down and get to know each other and trust each other. You know, today we had a bunch of folks out and we went through the shooting training scenario. And a lot of people came out and said, man, I can't believe I killed everybody in there. You know, you guys have a difficult job. So we also have to get to know each other and trust each other and work together. This is our community.
Well, to follow up with the money thing, I will talk to you after, but I know people who provide it for free based off grant money, so we will talk about that. You want me to? Okay. I don't want to grandstand, so I'll limit it to like 30 seconds, I promise. Center for Policing Equity, grant funded, they come in, they do assessment on what a particular issue is in your area or your department. So they would, maybe you have a gender bias, maybe there's a racial bias. They figure out what your specific department, county, whatever the issue is, make an assessment, provide training, and then do follow-up to see if it's working, and then change the training as necessary if it's not. One of the main things is implicit bias training, and it's actual things you can do to minimize implicit bias. And Chief Beal, I'll be in Columbus tomorrow. I'd like you are as well. I saw your name on the agenda, so maybe you'll hear me talk about a little bit of that tomorrow in Columbus.
I need to make just a quick observation on the issue of trust, because we know we have had that conversation, or we made that point here, that trust between police and the community that they serve is important, and that's constant work. It's not one and done ever, by the way. It's like any relationship wants constant work. But what's lost in the dialogue, and I was stunned out of the research of Cincinnati by the RAND Corporation, because they looked at the issue of procedural justice and trust of police by the community, and there were clear demographic differences, right, on the level of trust expressed by various segments of the community. What was also interesting, which was ignored after the first survey, not only did they ask about trust between citizens and the police who serve them, they also asked a related question of trust within the community. How much do you trust other persons in your community? I was stunned by the answer to that question, because it was presented, and I think it's still the dialogue we have today. If we just improve trust between police and the community, that's going to solve the problems. If there's high levels of distrust within the community between individuals who live in those communities, huge problems will continue. And police get called to intervene in situations in communities where communities can't manage it themselves, right? It's called informal social control. So where there's a strong, cohesive community, clear set of norms, communities act to enforce those norms, police don't get a lot of calls. Where there isn't that level of social control, police get called to intervene a lot. So we don't at the same time address the issue of trust within communities. I can't tell you how many people I've sat down with who say, I won't report it because I can't trust I'm going to be okay if I do. That's an issue. So we have to work on both, not just one or the other.
Black people are over 6 times as likely as white people to be killed by police in Ohio. In light of this alarming fact and the unnecessary killings of Tamir Rice and John Crawford, do you think there should be changes in police policies?
I'm not familiar with that particular data. I will say that it's clear if there's a disproportionality, there needs to be an understanding of why. And with the understanding of the why, then becomes of what needs to be done about it. So I'd be interested in any research you can share on that.
Gentlemen, I'm Judge Capizzi from Montgomery County Juvenile Court. And I think 98% of officers and deputies do a great job. My concern is I see too many young men in my court who have weapons. And many, many years ago in this community, when I was at City Hall, we did a gun buyback program where the community came together with the police departments from both the city and the county, and we got some guns off the street. Now, I don't see kids in the streets with Uzis. I see them with basic old handguns. And half the time we're looking to see if they were inoperable. And so it seemed to me, and I don't know if they're successful, but I think NAACP could be a leader in this community if they work with the police departments, the sheriff's office, and the courts to start a gun buyback program to get some of these weapons off the street so that if the kids don't have these guns, police officers aren't going to shoot them because they're not having a weapon. So we know there's shootings when there shouldn't be. You get rid of one excuse and you get these weapons off the street. Thank you. Any thought of the ability or accessibility to do a gun buyback program in this community?
We did a gun turn-in, not a gun buyback some years ago that had probably more participation than we probably anticipated. I would tell you that the research, there's a study done at University of Maryland that was commissioned by United States Congress, somewhat dated now, 1997, but they looked at all funded governmental crime prevention programs to see whether they worked or not. So the name of the study was Preventing Crime, of course, what does it was promising. One of the things that was listed as does not work was gun buyback programs. I don't believe there's any research since that I'm aware of that says that they are effective in reducing gun crime. Okay. Now, whether there's effectiveness in reducing suicides by firearm or other accidental shootings, I don't know. But if we're talking about reducing gun crime, at least this really comprehensive congressional study was pretty resoundingly, no, they don't work.
Okay. As you know, there are a lot more guns on the street today than were in 1997. And any way we can, anything we can try to help keep guns out of children's hands, we should try. And I think we should try again. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you, Judge.
Let me make a statement to that, Tony. We used to have gun back.
Many years ago, $25 a gun.
Yeah.
I sat there that day when guns were coming all over the community, and a lot of them were alcohol, I agree. You're giving them $25. And even the public awareness aspect of that, I think is beneficial to people.
We had 3 of them. On one such occasion, a woman came in and said her son had a gun in her house and she wanted it removed. We got with the police, we went over there, and a gun was up underneath his mattress. So that's a testimony to that situation. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Deborah, and my question is, well, back in the day, I grew up in an era where police were our friends. You know, they walked the beat, they were in the neighborhoods. And in light of everything that has transpired in the recent past, what is the act when you're stopped by a police officer, when you encounter a police officer in any situation? What does a young person do in order to maintain safety?
Eric, you want to handle that?
First thing I would do is cooperate. If the officer does something that he's not supposed to do or is perceived that he is not supposed to have done, there are things that a family can do to follow up with the command staff. I know just as the Trotwood Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, and the Dayton Police Department, we all have internal affairs people who follow up on those things. If you get pulled over, an officer asks to see your driver's license or some form of ID. If you have the ID, give them the ID. And how you start the encounter, if you start on a good positive note, it should end on a good positive note. Sometimes, though, you may be arrested for whatever the violation was if you have a warrant, but you're not going to put yourself in any more at risk. So I would say what I tell my family is if you get pulled over, answer whatever questions they want, cooperate. And if they've done something they shouldn't have done, get with me and we will follow up and go through the procedures that way. Because you're fighting with the officer on the scene is only going to enhance whatever the situation is against you, not for you.
This concludes our session. You've been very helpful. You've been very polite. You've been very courteous. Thank our guests for the great work they've done.
Hold on for 1 second. Hold on for 1 second. This is just addressing the one gentleman's question back there because somebody had emailed this same question. It's really not a question. It's one young man asked about when to use, a gun, whether or not it's a black person or white person. But this right here was really dealing with. And this is a real life situation. There was a Caucasian citizen on James H. McGee about 2 years ago, a year ago, and he was walking around with an assault rifle in front of a housing project. And so the sentiment of the one young man was asking, well, is justice for African Americans versus justice for Caucasian, is there a difference? That was a question he was raising. Well, this man was walking around with this assault rifle, but nothing happened to that young man. The police cordially came up to him, asked him what he was doing. He had a right to carry the weapon because it's an open carry state. But then there was another situation, as we know, the John Crawford situation, and he's gunned down. So that's really what the young man was really talking about in terms of what does justice look like for African Americans versus Caucasian or any other race when someone is holding a weapon. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's a great observation. We want to thank our guests, and they've done an excellent job, and we want to give them a little praise.
And let's give Reverend Fox a round of applause for organizing this. And our guests also did a fantastic job. Now, we encourage you to come out next month, same time, third week of the month, fourth Monday of the month, to come to our meeting next week. If you want to stay engaged with us, follow us on our Facebook page, Dayton Unit NAACP, and you have an opportunity to know the various topics. Thank you.